afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. Let me start by saying that as IT professionals, we all love salespeople, right? They speak to our decision makers, sell them something, and then we end up with the struggles of making it work. And the one thing we realize, it's normally not the technology. It's always about the people, the changes, and I think in security terms, the nefarious people finding bugs and finding ways of making that software problematic. With that note, I'm trying to say to you that I'm actually not a salesperson. I'm a CISO. So I have the same fears and worries and things that keep me up at night as quite a few of you. And maybe just to mention some of that, so Sasol is a global manufacturing company, and there's this one headline from Gartner that keeps on playing in the back of my head, and it says that operational technology, or OT, will be weaponized by 2025, and that's really significant and scary. One of the other key items is specifically recently when a lot of information became available about how hacking groups work, and I'm not going to go into the details of where that info comes from, but a lot of testing has happened, and they find that encryption algorithms can encrypt about 10 gigabytes of data in 1 minute. So that's 50 gigabytes in 5 minutes. And maybe just to make it more real, that's over 100,000 files on average that can be encrypted in 5 minutes. It's quite scary how efficient those programs are. And you can just imagine the damage that can do in about a span of 15 minutes. And yeah, maybe one last item that I need to share that keeps me up at night is, as part of that revelation of how hacker groups operate, they found that they have an employee of the month. How do you compete with that when we're trying to make ends meet? So just an interesting tidbit there. Nonetheless, like I said, I'm not a salesperson, but I am going to try and sell you the value of DevOps, because I do believe it plays a significant role in how we look at cybersecurity. So let me start by saying, why am I saying DevSecOps is a significant tool in our defenses? Let me start by saying it is not just about development or coding. DevSecOps is a way of working that can impact your entire IT delivery, whether it's a cloud-based solution that you are rolling out, whether it's updates to a packaged solution, whether it's infrastructure. You can apply DevSecOps methodologies. So it's not just about people developing and coding software. Next key thing, it's not something that you just implement and doesn't require organizational change. It's a completely different way of looking at the IT delivery pipeline. It's not a tool. It's not about adding tools, clicking a button and saying, great, we are now DevOps or DevSecOps. It's a complete cultural shift in your organization, in your business, in the way you approach things. And then it's not a skill. It's a methodology. It's a way of doing things. And then lastly, just another myth, it's not about developers doing operations. Not at all. It's completely looking at how do you integrate and look at across the value chain. I attribute 3 key things to DevOps or DevSecOps. Collaboration, because the teams have to collaborate across the entire IT value chain. Significant automation across the entire delivery pipeline, and really aiming to get to continuous delivery and continuous integration. And I'll speak a bit more about that as we move along. Okay, So let's get into the crux of it. Why does DevSecOps promise to deliver value to cybersecurity? And it starts with this fundamental concept of shift left. In fact, let me take one step back and say that the value of DevSecOps, given the demand that we as IT folks face, business wants things faster, they want it cheaper, we need to deliver more securely. And how do you do that? How do you go faster and yet make sure that things are secure? Now, first of all, you've got to look at the entire life cycle of your IT solutions. You cannot look at one component, because if you develop something very fast and it causes problems in operations, the solution is still a problem, and you are actually not going faster, you're creating more problems. So you've got to look at the entire delivery pipeline. And this is, in fact, the power of the DevSecOps and the automation. When you start looking at this and you're saying, if I am accountable for the problem that I caused downstream, how do I consider that upfront? And that's this fundamental concept of shift left. So when you start doing that, at idea generation or idea generation phase, you start asking those questions around security, around security by design, privacy by design. You build that into the first idea phase of solving a challenge, solving a problem, finding a solution. And maybe just on that note, again talking about automation, we've actually tried something very interesting. We tried to automate that into our delivery pipeline, where we looked at a workflow-based AI solution that asks all these questions up front, specifically around the security components, the privacy by design components. Needless to say, we're still struggling to make it work perfectly, but that's the type of thinking you need to implement around DevOps and automation. Can you enforce and build that into the beginning? And that's one of the items around shift left. Let's look at the next phase of delivery when you start developing. If you start shifting left, you're building those code checks, you're building that security checks into your development environment. So when you automate this, the developer cannot release that into a production environment, into a quality environment, without having passed your code standard checks. Let's say we're looking for hard-coded credentials, etc., that's bad coding, you can block it. Your next level, you can actually do automated testing, and I'm not going to call out tools, but there's a bunch of tools that you can potentially use, open source and other, that can do that checking of your environments, of the programs, automated pen testing. So before you even release that into production, you are able to do those checks. Let's move on. Let's look at when you are hitting the operation space. What can you be doing in that space, considering security? So if your security operations team are able to position their questions up front when they understand the idea, when they understand what's being developed, they can actually build that in from day one. So what are those key items that you'll be looking at? What are those triggers? What are those scenarios and use cases that you want your security operations team to be monitoring for? Those can be asked upfront, those can be built before you even reach production. What I'm talking about is a mind shift where we typically would take these things, take them into production, uncover bugs, uncover problems, and then try in hindsight to fix them or retrospectively to fix them when we have massive issues. Similar to that concept, when we are starting to look at how software is developed, what are the components of that software, you can actually capture that upfront in terms of, I think, what is being called the software bill of material. What are all those dependencies? What are those programs, log4j, etc., that this package is dependent on? And you have a complete repository of that. And that's being checked, continuously checked. Again, there's a number of tools, and I don't want to be selling tools. I did say I'm not a salesman. But the concept is what is important. You can implement and you can do those security checks upfront. You can build in those questions upfront at idea phase. So what I've done is I've called these some funny terms, ops before dev, just to put the concept in place. Sec before dev. What are those security things that we need to be considering? And if you think about this, as you practice this, you become more au fait with it. You can start developing those standard questions that needs to be asked up front. You can improve it. You can take lessons learned and start adding it to this, creating a faster, more efficient system across the pipeline. And I think lastly what I want to touch on, the ultimate goal we're trying to get to is how do we get to continuous integration and continuous delivery. And that's really about being able to release that fix into your production environment in real time or near real time. And once you achieve that state, and I think we're all worried about business operations and we have this notion that everything has to be tested 100 times, signed off 20 times. If you are able to build those confident automated tests that can run in seconds, that will give you the confidence that you can release those updates into production because you've done your critical testing. So that automated testing, both functional, that the product is still working, the critical functions are being delivered, and from a security perspective, I've done a certain battery of security tests that gives me the confidence this can go into production. We can be looking at releasing those fixes to the production environment with speed. Think about the typical patch Tuesday, where you've got all of these patches that's being released. There's always this concern, is it going to impact production? And how many times did we not have to roll back some of these things because it breaks something else? You should know the answer in seconds and know how to address the real problem. So in a nutshell, that's what I'm trying to sell to you, that DevSecOps provide us that opportunity to meet the need of being able to update, fix, test things in our production environment, to our production environments, aligned with the type of time requirement that we currently face. And on that note of time requirement, if you look at the average time it takes for an exploit or bug to actually become an exploit that's available out there. A couple of years ago, it used to be 45 days, and we were quite comfortable with this cycle that we've developed as IT professionals. On a monthly basis, I do security patches. It's outside of peak time, and month on, we do the same thing. There's a certain set time. That was fine when the average was sitting around 45 days. That number has come down significantly over the last couple of years. I think the latest average shows that the time between finding a bug and the exploit being out in the wild is sitting somewhere between 5 to 7 days. That monthly cycle of patching doesn't work anymore. And one of the examples I think around that was Kasia or Kaseya, however you want to pronounce that. From the time the bug was made available or made known, it was literally minutes before that was being used to attack a large variety of companies and organizations. It was not even days. So that 4 to 5 days is an average, but there are scenarios where we've seen this happen literally within less than an hour. So how do we respond to that? You need the ability to confidently release fixes, updates into your production environment. And as far as I can tell you, DevSecOps has the potential to do that. You need to get your automated testing right, not just functional, security. Then you can have that comfort that should work for you. Okay, I think I've said enough about the type of potential, but let me remind you. So it starts, your value of DevSecOps is that it starts right at idea generation, all the way through the life cycle. I briefly mentioned about shifting right, because we always speak about shift left. What about when it's running in production? what are those flags that we need to be looking at? That is actually shifting right. You need to think about what the security operations and operations team are worried about, and they need to be able to influence the way we develop our solutions. So it's not just the security team pushing their ideas and requirements to the left, as the developer as well pushing to the right and understanding. Yeah, I think I'm going to skip over most of this. I think I've covered it, but maybe one point, compliance. A lot of the previous discussion was around governance and compliance. And when you're looking at creating speed and how do you do that, you need to be able to utilize automation. What does smart governance look like? How can you automate that? Do we have this dire need to follow this traditional path of having a cab, having 50 pages signed 50 times? Or is there a way to automate this in a seamless way? And we need to explore what smart governance look like across your delivery pipeline. Okay, moving on. I wanted to share some of the lessons. So we underwent a major transformation about 5 to 7 years ago. And the one key point I just wanted to share, it's not software that you install. You don't press a button and you DevSecOps or you DevOps. You've got to rethink the way we're looking at the entire end-to-end delivery pipeline and value chain for software. Right from the top, what is the value of that IT and technology to your organization? Right down to how do you actually support and run this? Because the value of IT is not a single point. It's that continuous value that you're delivering. And that's fundamentally how you need to look at DevOps in your organizations. You cannot deliver something to the developers and walk away. You've got to think about how do you maintain the value to business? How do you do it faster, cheaper, simpler, more secure? Let me not bore you with what this looks like in my organization, but I think the point I was just trying to highlight, you've got to look at this end to end, the entire IT for IT value chain, from project through to implementation. Just some closing thoughts and key considerations. So when you're looking at DevSecOps, or I suppose any technology for that matter, you've got to consider those future pressures, emerging technologies, trends, and what are some of the key challenges we need to be looking at if you are considering a DevSecOps as a methodology. Dev, the way we're looking at it as very skilled programmers developing something, is under significant pressure. The demand from business, low code, no code, citizen developers where they can deliver their own solutions, and we know IT departments doesn't have the resources to keep up. How do you deal with that? And we've addressed that by creating guardrails in the form of a delivery pipeline and a DevSecOps tool chain where they can develop their solutions, and we ensure we implement the relevant checks and governance across that. So you don't need to worry about shadow IT. You need to figure out how do you manage it to make sure it remains secure. Another key concept, I think I briefly touched on it, around the software bill of material. And just at the bottom, the graphic is supposed to show that open source software is everywhere. I think we all still have the smiles and scars of Log4j, and I can mention a bunch of others. How do you ensure that you are prepared for that upfront? How do you know what's in your environment? How do you know what components is within that? And then I think when we look at things like AI ops, which is quite significant, infrastructure as code, we're no longer thinking about infrastructure in the same traditional way. You generate it through your code. But how do you factor that in? And then the use and the value of AI and machine learning in your monitoring of your environments, in fact, across your delivery pipeline, because you've got to protect your DevSecOps tools with as much rigor as you would protect your production environments. How do you build that into your designs, and how do you factor that in? I think, irrespective of what I've said today, the key message is still it's always about people. I started speaking about salespeople and what they're selling us, and we find that most of the time it's not the technology, it's change management, it's hackers in the form of people troubling us. When you're looking at transforming to a DevSecOps, your challenge is people. We've been doing IT a certain way based on the concept of we're running a factory. We've realized that doesn't work. We need to be faster, cheaper, simpler, more secure. DevSecOps does give you that opportunity, but you need to focus on how do you get the people to understand this, embrace this, and think about it across the entire software delivery pipeline, and not just as point solutions. I think I am out of time. I'm going to call it there. Hopefully, I sold you on DevSecOps as a CISO who has the same fears that all of you have at night. Thank you.